Do you think that this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children, and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out, and if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed, and then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully. First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge. Second point, is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a prostitute, but those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them. Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture. Yep. And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations, and I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individuals would like to admit. And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet, that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children, that affect my grandchildren. We're more interconnected than we would like to admit. So no, those children are not being punished for anything they did wrong, but yes, they're born into a cursed, messed up world, and there are consequences to that. I mean, I benefited from going to Davidson College, and a lot of people sacrificed to put Davidson together. You benefited from going to Oxford University, and there were a lot of people who have over many years given sacrificially to build that. So there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations of our decisions. And also, the Bible never says that those children and all those people go to eternity separate from God. I'm convinced that we will see those children in heaven if they were killed before an age of accountability. So the justice of God will ultimately triumph.
Yeah.
Do I have problems with the text? Yes, of course I have problems with the text. I don't understand it exactly. I don't understand what God is doing exactly there, why he says that kind of thing. But I'm also convinced that hyperbole is being used. And I think that's a very important thing. For instance, when I was in high school, we used to say, we're going to kill the opposing team that we're going to play that weekend. Not meaning we're literally going to kill them. And the whole idea of, in the Hebrew harem, H-E-R-E-M, of clearing out these people from the promised land. The whole idea that God had given them over 400 years to repent, and they had chosen not to, and now God clears them out. You know, I think it's a complex issue, more complex than the person would allow it to be, who just says, I just can't believe that God would do something like that.
What kind of instruction had these people been given? You know, like the people of Ai, the people of Jericho, the Canaanites. I mean, did they have Jewish prophets coming to them and saying, you should repent of your way, or were they just sort of expected to work it out on their own?
Fascinating question. I'm not sure. I do not know. Obviously, they have consciences. We all have consciences.
Yeah.
And when you study ethics from around the world, it's amazing that it seems we're all like reading off the same sheet music.
Yeah. My job here isn't to say that this is wrong. My job is to say something like what Lincoln said of slavery. If this isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong. You know, if there is such a thing as objective morality, I find it very. I mean, look, we just condemned the Canaanites in part for, you know, they were killing children. Well, that's exactly what God ordered the Israelites to do when they came into their nation. And we say, okay, well, these people were sinful, idolatrous, and they should have repented. Well, the same is true of the Israelites. They were sinful, they were idolatrous. And yet they had the benefit of having the prophet of God come to them with literal stone tablets telling them what to do. And even then it took them a few tries to get right. The Canaanites didn't have that. And yet when the Israelites are sinful, they get a prophet who comes and sets them straight. When the Canaanites are sinful, they get obliterated, they get exterminated, they get chased out.
Just the same way the Israelites were at first the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
True, but it's wrong for the Assyrians to do that. It was wrong for the Babylonians to do that.
Yeah, but the Old Testament insists that that was part of God's judgment on the Israelites for them doing the child sacrifice, temple prostitution, idolatry. God, you know, so it's God. It gets back to, does God have the right to judge? Yes, he judged the Canaanites, but then remember, a few hundred years later, he judged the Jews, first at the hands of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians.
So I want to talk about the hyperbole thing, right? Because maybe we're not talking about killing everybody. Maybe
we're obviously not, because they were appearing in the next book.
But okay, so for example, in the destruction of Ai, 12,000 people fell that day. All the people of Ai. That's what's said in the book of Joshua. Now, maybe all the people of Ai is like an exaggeration, but 12,000 people. It's pretty specific. It'd be a weird thing to be doing as hyperbole, right? We have a number of people, 12,000 people. We know it's men, we know it's women, we know it's children. We know that that's not hyperbole. We know that thousands of men were killed. We know that, I don't want to get this wrong, perhaps we should look at the text. Yeah, so in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all of the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 people fell that day. 12,000 men and women fell that day. All the people of Ai. So we know that women are being killed, non-combatants being killed. We know that there are thousands of them. We also know that there were people who had left. They'd run into the wilderness. They were out of the promised land. But the Israelites chased after them and then killed them in the wilderness. And it says all of them were put to the sword. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Maybe that some of them ran away. Maybe all of the ones that they captured were put to the sword, but some of them managed to actually run away, and those are the people who show up in the next chapter. But it's only because, you know, for want of trying, that they managed to survive. But maybe there's just hyperbole. But we know that 12,000 people were killed. We know that the Israelites then turned around after killing the fleeing combatants, came back into the city and killed who's left. Well, who's left? The women, the children, the disabled. That, to be clear, do you believe that innocent children were killed by Israelites on the command of God? It's a historical fact.
I believe that innocent children were killed by Israeli bombs, and they happen to be Palestinians, part of Hamas maybe, or Hezbollah. I believe that there are consequences to human decisions that stretch down through the generations and then impact a lot of innocent people. And I think we're a little naive if we think that we can go into Iraq or fight a desert storm and no innocent people are going to be killed. It's one of the tragedies of war, which is a result of the sinful human heart.
But suppose, you know, the Israeli government said, leave alive nothing that breathes. Kill the soldiers, but then once you've done that, turn around, go back, kill the women, kill the children, kill their animals, because this land is yours. I think that people wouldn't be satisfied on falling back on the defense. Hey, this is the consequence of war. This is what happens. I think people would say, okay, but the fundamental rule of just war, which I'm told is sort of stems out of the Christian tradition, is, you know, proportionate response.
Yes, and I agree with you. But here's another problem. God told Abraham to take Isaac up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice his son. Now, if someone interprets that as being God's laying down wise principles for good parenting, they're an idiot.
Sure, yeah.
That is not what Genesis chapter 2 is communicating. God gave Abraham a very specific command, and it was not to give an example of wise parenting. It was, Abraham, who's number one in your heart? Is it going to be God or is it going to be your son? Who are you going to build your future on? Your son or me? Similarly, what Israel does there in the Old Testament is not examples of just war theory. No, it is a unique example of God using a theocracy, and we don't live in a theocracy. We don't have a theocracy in Israel now. We're definitely not a theocracy in the United States or in the UK. God using a theocracy to carve out a land that he brings the Messiah into. That's a one-time deed, because you're absolutely right. It is not an example of just war. No way. I recoil at that as you do, I'm sure.
Yeah, because of course the difference in this case is that you have the orders from the top man. It's sort of, if there is some extraordinary circumstance in which this kind of otherwise morally condemnable behavior can be justified, you better have the authority to know that you're making the right decision. And in this case, the Christian will be able to say that they did have that authority. But I mean, it's a struggle.
Yes, it is.
We're talking about the intentional killing of non-combatant children. And I read this text as a land dispute. I read in Deuteronomy where God gives instructions when you march up onto a city to attack it, like in the broad sense. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and engage in battle, which isn't entirely unreasonable given what the terms of peace are, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. Women and children being described as plunder that can be used because God has given them to you as plunder. But of course, those are the people who you're attacking not because they're in the promised land, and it's just, well, look, we gave them a chance to leave. What are we supposed to do? This is God's chosen. No, these are other cities. Because it goes on, however, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all detestable things that they do in worshipping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. This idea of marching up to a city, and even if they accept you, they're going to become your indentured servants. And if they don't, then you may take the women and children as plunder, and you may use the plunder the Lord gives you. But of course, if you're marching into a city of one of the nations that you've been promised by God, then don't leave alive anything that breathes. Kill all of the children, kill all of them. I mean, it's the difference there, in other words, about like the people in the inherited lands and the people outside of it, tells me that the explanation for why these people need to be completely and utterly destroyed is because this is our land. We want this land. It seems to be, and when I read about somebody intentionally driving out or killing nations of people so that they can sort of essentially ethnically cleanse a land, I don't know what else to call that other than a genocide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.